I'm not used to speaking into a mic, so hopefully I won't hold it too close. So just really quickly, thank you very much for coming today. Thank you. I've never been to Poland or to Krakow. It's a fabulous city. It's so beautiful. Hi, friend in the back. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about lean game development. This is really a philosophy about how to develop games. A little bit about me. So I started my career at Linden Lab making Second Life. I left to join PlayStation, where I worked with Oscar Clark in the back. Hi. So we worked on PlayStation Home together, and I was leading product development and management for PlayStation Home in SCEA, so on the American side of the product house. I left Sony to start my own company, CultTV, which was acquired 15 months after we launched. And then I joined GSN Games, where I am now. So a little bit about GSN. So we were, last year, 2 of the top 5 grossing iPad games in the US. We are in the social casino space, but a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today can be generalized to any free-to-play game. It's a little harder in the console space, so if any of you are console developers, I'd be very happy to talk to you about adapting this to your process, but it's a little more complex. So we are also number 2 in the social casino space on Facebook, and we have 10 million monthly active users. We're also looking to grow. So a little bit about lean game development. Are any of you familiar with lean development? A little bit. Okay, so we'll start with the basics. So lean development is a product management and development methodology that was popularized by this guy, Eric Ries, in his book, The Lean Startup. This way of making consumer products has really taken hold in consumer web and also in mobile. So companies like Instagram, companies like Google, big companies now, Facebook early on, all use the primary tenets of lean development to build their businesses. But in the game industry, the game industry has been very reticent to adopt lean development tactics. It is definitely a different way of doing business that was until lately very strange to the game industry. So the whole idea of doing data-driven development, for example, or player-driven development is new. You know, in the console space, we were developing games largely for ourselves, which was great, but I think there's been a shift in product management in the game industry, and now there's more openness. So the primary tenets of lean development are to get to market fast with a minimum viable product. I get a lot of questions about what exactly is a minimum viable product. Usually a minimum viable product is the absolute minimum number of features that are required to validate whether or not you've made something good. And minimum number of features is usually kind of vague, but typically for developers it means take what you think is the minimum number of features and cut it in half. And that's probably the actual minimum viable product. So the goal here is really to get to market fast with a minimum viable product so that you can validate product market fit. So that's a fancy way of saying people care about what you've made for them. Okay, so it's a fancy way of saying that your audience thinks that what you've made is good. It resonates with them. And then, last but definitely not least, you iterate. So a core tenet of lean game development is this idea of failing fast and failing often. I know that this sounds counterintuitive, but not all ways of building great products are intuitive. And so I'm going to give you just a little example. This is pretty much out of the book, but it's the most commonly given example for why failing fast and failing often is important. So let's say that you're going to be sending out a lot of letters, and there may be 2 ways of doing that. So the first way would be to go through the entire process of putting postage on the envelope, addressing the envelope with a label, stuffing the envelope, sealing the envelope, so doing one envelope at a time, complete end to end. The other way of doing this is to create an assembly line. where you maybe put all of the postage on all of the envelopes first, and then maybe you label all of the envelopes, and then finally you get to stuffing all the envelopes. So how many of you think that doing one envelope at a time is the quickest way and the most efficient way? Anyone? So it is, actually. And for one reason, it's because that you can identify any flaws in your assumptions early on. Okay, so what this means, an example in this case would be, let's say that you go through the entire process once, you've put a stamp on, you've put a label on, you've stuffed the envelope, and all of a sudden you realize that the envelope is too small for the stuffers. So, you don't want to get 3/4 of the way through the entire set before you realize that there's a problem with the assumptions that you've made. So it's important to just go quickly through once and make sure that you're on the right track. So lean game development is, it's a philosophy, I would say. A student at Carnegie Mellon told me that in his game design program, nobody would tell him what a production philosophy was in games, and I'm here to tell you that lean game development is definitely a philosophy of building products and services. So at GSN, and I think that this can be generalized for any company that's doing lean game development, we have about a 25% fail rate at the pitch process. So I'm not going to talk about the pitch process too much today because we have a lot of other stuff to cover. But for us, the pitch process looks a lot like an elevator pitch for startups. So, one sentence about what your game concept is, one sentence about the market opportunity, so how many people would be interested in playing your game, a little bit of information about the level of effort. So is this a small, medium, or large game that you're trying to build? And a little bit about the differentiator. Why is your game unique in the marketplace? About 25% of our pitches fail, but anybody in our company can pitch, and we socialize all of the core tenets of what makes a good pitch so that we can get as many people through that process as possible. Many of our games, the games that we build and ship, were the brainchildren of our developers, of our marketers, of basically everybody in the company. So the second step is prototyping, and about 50% of our prototypes fail. And we'll talk more about the prototyping phase soon. Minimum viable game, about 75% of these games fail. That's because we are in a hits-driven business. So one of the goals of lean development is to figure out what is going to be your next hit early on so you know where to invest. Unfortunately, that sometimes means a lot of games fail before they make it. You guys have probably heard the story of Angry Birds and Rovio. They were making games for like 30 years in their mother's basement. They made 50 games before they made Angry Birds and blew up. The next step is to optimize. So you're going to want to optimize and iterate pretty much any game that you create in this model. It's an incredibly important part of the process. And then last but not least, expansion. So some people like to think of the expansion phase as when you get a game ready for a full launch. So are any of you from big companies here? No? Small companies? Indies? Yeah? Okay. All right. Let's talk about how to adapt this to, we'll talk about specifically how to do this for indies. Okay, so let's talk about the prototyping phase. So I hear a lot of complaints in the game development community that players can't see past a look of visual polish. So if you put a product out there and it has crappy art, nobody's going to play your game or think it's fun. I hear that a lot. So let's talk about the prototyping phase and let's look at some of the beauties that GSN has shipped. So this was a mini golf solitaire game. So this was golf solitaire with a progression mechanic in it. It took us 3 weeks to get to market with this game. We had one engineer and a quarter of a game designer, meaning that the game designer was working on a lot of other projects at the time. We built this game in HTML5 as sort of an experiment to see how HTML5 would perform for us in our business. We like to experiment with new technologies in the prototyping phase a lot because we can. And then we sourced the art from a Google image search. So we just typed in golf courses, and we pulled a bunch of different images from Google Image, and we applied a Photoshop filter to all of those images so that they would look the same. And we did have access to some reusable technology, for example, a bit of tutorial UI, so that we could teach players how to play the game. But we built this very, very quickly with a tiny team. And our players loved it. So this is an example of a success for us. We've also failed a lot, and I'll show you an example of a failure later. But we had 4,500 players in our GSN beta community play this game. We had an average session duration of 27 minutes. Over 80% of our players played for more than 5 minutes, and 25% finished all 18 levels with session durations of 60 minutes or more. That's pretty good for a prototype. So I get a lot of questions about key performance indicators. What does success look like with a game that you've only invested 3 weeks in to make? And these were excellent numbers for us. With the kind of average session duration, and the fact that so many players completed all of the levels of this game, we knew that we had something that was somewhat a pretty sticky experience. So if you're an indie, you might not have a big beta community that you can ship your product to, but don't let that stop you, because there are many different ways of doing user testing and collecting feedback. Okay, so you want to collect quantitative and qualitative feedback. This is an example of quantitative feedback. So where we were just looking at data. If you're an indie, that might just look like a play test. For you, you might send a build out to everybody that you know in the game community and ask them to play. And what might look like success there, if you can measure the average session duration and maybe just see how many people come back and play your game for a second time, that's usually a really good indicator of whether or not you've made something that's fun. So we also collect qualitative data. So, that's basically, we send out a survey and we ask people some basic questions about the game, what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it. 86% agreed strongly that this game was fun, and 80% said they would recommend it to a friend. The most common requests were save, undo, and sound. Only 3 players asked for better graphics. So this was a real surprise for us, because we thought, oh no, we're shipping a game that has, basically Google image search photos in it, and there's no way people are going to accept this level of quality, visual quality. Well, it turned out that they did. They had a lot of fun playing the game. So this game we made for a hackathon. We get a lot of our prototypes from hackathons. We're a big believer in the power of hackathons. And I could do a whole nother talk on that, but we don't have time right now. So we made this sweet game right here. So this is a high-low game. And we themed it with cats, because our audience is primarily 40 to 60-year-old women. And we thought, they must love cats, right? 40 to 60-year-old women. So let me tell you about this game. It took us 3 weeks to make a prototype. Again, same team size as before. We had to do 2 iterations on this game. So we had an early game. We had a first version of it, and we thought, oh no, this is confusing. So we tested this on a service called usertesting.com. And it turned out that nobody understood how to play. So we had to go back and rework our UI. So we shipped it. 4,500 players, again. This game did not do well at all. So we had a 3-minute average session duration. 85% of players played for less than 5 minutes. But interestingly, nobody really complained about the art, but everyone complained about the theme. So it turns out that our players, our market, they hate cats. They don't want cats in games. So that was a surprise to us. But in this case, again, not very many people complaining about the art, but complaining a lot about the theme. So key takeaways. So you probably want to reuse any tech that you already have in the prototyping phase. This is very important to moving very quickly. You want to analyze both quantitative and qualitative data. So qualitative data, again, give a survey to the people who are playing your game. And then quantitative data, try to measure something. There are a lot of out-of-the-box services that you can use, like Mixpanel, for example, to collect data from your players. So you don't, if you're an indie, you don't need to build a really complex analytics stack in order to get some basic measurements to see if people like your game and enjoy it. And then prototype to validate a single hypothesis. So this is really, really important. Every prototype that we build is trying to prove out something specific that we want to test. So in the first game, the solitaire game, we wanted to see if a progression mechanic would increase session duration. And it did. In the second game, we wanted to test the theme. If we make a high-low game with cats, are people going to love it? No, they didn't. So always have something in mind for what you're testing in the prototype phase. Really important. And also, give your players credit. So they're usually more sophisticated than you think. If you tell them, hey, this is a really early version of my game and I would love your feedback, they'll understand and they're not going to fault you for building a game without a lot of visual polish. If you don't make a fun game, that's on you. Let's talk about the minimum viable game stage. I'm going to see how I'm doing on time. Okay, we have a little bit of time. Okay, so the MVG or MVP, as it's called, minimum viable product, minimum viable game. So I hear from a lot of people that games without enough content will bore players. Now, if you're making an episodic game after you've achieved success, if you do not have enough content, yes, your players will be bored. So you do need to provide content, but not at this stage in the life cycle. Okay, the minimum viable game stage exists to validate your core game loop, to make sure that your game is fun. That's what this phase is for. It's important to build a small product or service when you start, because I can tell you from experience, if you build something that's huge, it will be very hard to figure out what's going wrong, and something will go wrong. Something always goes wrong in game development. But the bigger your product is, the harder it is to isolate what's failing. If you start small, you can isolate not only what's failing, but also what's succeeding, okay? And you can do user-driven product development that way. So here's an example of a game that we made. This was actually a technology project that we did during a hackathon. You'll hear me say that a lot. So this was, because we're in the social casino space, we make a lot of slot games. We also make bingo games and card games and some casual games, but to a lesser extent. So this was a hackathon project. It took us 2 weeks to get to market with this, with one engineer and one artist. This was also an HTML5 game. A lot of fun to build HTML5 games, by the way. We released this to a small percentage of our entire base audience instead of releasing it to just our beta community. So we're a portal of many, many different games. And so we had the opportunity to ship this in a cohort test. So this game was so simple that I think it probably would not have met Sid Meier's definition of a game as a series of interesting choices. This was just one pay line and 3 reels. But it was massively successful for us, and so we built a 5-reel slot game. So you'll notice here, we did actually about 6 different skins for this engine, and we shipped them, and this skin right here, Classic 777, sort of blew up. The game wasn't sticky. It had terrible retention key performance indicators, but people loved the theme. They were clicking on the theme a lot. So we identified that this was a resonant theme with our audience, and we built a 5-reel slot game from it. So it took us 8 weeks to get to market with this. 5 reels, 15 pay lines. We only had 1 artist and 1 engineer. We built this game in Flash. We had already validated the theme from the previous test, and this blew up for us. It's actually on both mobile, let's see, Android, iOS, Facebook, not our .com site, but Android, iOS, and Facebook. This is a top 3 game for us in our catalog. So key takeaways, you want to validate the core game loop. This game was very, very simple, but we polished it a lot. So it didn't take us very long to build this. We spent about 25% of our cycle just polishing the core game loop, polishing. So validate the core game loop. You can always add content later, okay? And we have a lot of other examples of when to add content and how to add content later in the life cycle. We can talk about that. But also, the other thing that's really important to note is that content is never going to save a bad game mechanic. Okay, so if you sandbox your game and you don't ship it because you think that you need a lot of content, if what you've got there, your core game mechanic, isn't fun, people are not going to play, no matter what. So again, starting with the kernel, starting with the nugget is really, really important. Find the fun. So content matters. It absolutely matters, again, just to reinforce. But it doesn't matter at this stage of the process. Again, we're working slowly, okay? We're validating in the prototype phase, we're validating a hypothesis, usually the differentiator for the game. In the minimum viable game stage, we're validating the core game loop, okay? And then optimization happens, okay? So you have your minimum viable game and you ship it to real users, okay? So this isn't just getting your friends together and giving them pizza and having them sit down and playing through your game. That's fine at the prototype level, okay? But it's not okay at the minimum viable game level. The minimum viable game, find a way to get to market. It doesn't matter if you're shipping a mobile game and you come to a conference like this and you get 50 people to play your mobile game, okay? But you do need to ship it to a platform. So I hear a lot, optimization, you can only launch once, so sandbox to be sure. So this is my favorite myth, and I hear this one all the time. So the argument here is you can't ship too early, because if you ship something too early and it's not finished in your view of what finished means, then you've just lost your shot at creating a great game. So this is an example of a pachinko game that we made. So pachinko is a massively popular game genre in Japan. It comprises, I think, actually the majority of their game revenue. So it's hugely popular. We made this minimum viable game in 12 weeks. We had 30,000 players play it. This game was a big failure for us. So we had a 5-minute average session duration, which means that nobody thought it was fun. And we had a 20% bounce rate, also not a very good metric, at least for us. And 75% of players played for fewer than 5 minutes. That's not a good metric for game development, no matter what game you're building, okay? One of the interesting things, just to give you guys a note, I gave a talk at GDC San Francisco on cross-platform game development, and this was a case study there too, because interestingly, this game we didn't go through the standard pitch process on, so we didn't try to validate the market before we shipped this, so we didn't look into who the audience was. So it turns out that none of our players, so English-speaking countries, which is where we make the majority of our revenue, people in English-speaking countries don't really like pachinko that much. There isn't a huge opportunity there. I think if we had known that at the time, we probably wouldn't have made this game. So this is an example of a success, though. This game is very simply titled Video Bingo. Not much of a brand there. I would actually suggest that you try to build a brand around your products and don't name them Video Bingo. But this game, nevertheless, was a big hit for us. So we launched it in 2011. It took us 4 weeks to get to market with this, with 1 engineer and 1 artist. So again, very small teams. We are pumping out prototypes and minimum viable games all the time. It's a massive part of our cycle. And then when we find something that's sticky, we immediately go and invest. So we launched this very simple core game loop only, okay? And then we noticed it was taking off, so we started to iterate it and expand it. So we added a first-time user experience. We overhauled the entire Fatui, and we got a 58% lift in one-day return and a 26% lift in engagement. So those were big numbers for us, and that was just by adding some tutorialization, giving people a free game, teaching them how to play. Then we added virals for Facebook, and we got a 38% lift in viral new users and a 22% lift in invites sent. Since then, we've also added a lot of different power-ups. And the power-ups actually now comprise about 50% of the game's total revenue. But on day 1, we had no power-ups. We were really just looking for the stickiness when we launched the MVP. And then when we started to iterate, we started adding all kinds of things. We have done hundreds of tests on this game, actually. Hundreds and hundreds of tests. So, we've added half a dozen power-ups to this game. Monetization doubled when we did that. We've added fatuis, we've added virals, we added a progression map very recently, and we actually saw an over 100% boost in our retention KPIs. So very, very important to iterate. All of these success metrics that I'm showing you here, for every one of these tests that we did, we also did a test that failed. So again, fail fast, fail often. Okay, so do lots and lots and lots of testing. Ship any good idea that anybody in your company has. Build it, quickly and launch it. One of the benefits of using this process is that if you're working very fast and you're building small, polished games and you're launching small, polished features, you can say yes to anybody in your company that has a good idea. Really big game companies say no a lot, and we didn't want to do that. So we developed a process that would allow us to say yes. Key takeaways. So you can't afford to sandbox a game. So Pachinko, the game that I showed you first, we spent, again, 12 weeks on that game, a really long time trying to make it work. Now, if you're an indie, you might not have, 15 chances to take a year to develop each one of those games, okay? So if you strap yourself to a very, very long development cycle and then you fail, that could be the end of your company, the end of your game, worse, the end of your company, okay? So when you're small, it's even more important to stay agile and to try a lot of things to find the thing that's gonna work with your audience, to find that fun, right? Because again, hits-driven business, not every single thing that you build is gonna be fun. You have to keep iterating, keep trying, keep building new things, keep testing with real users who are in your target market. So second, you can't validate the core game mechanic without feedback. At every single step of our process, we collect feedback from real users. Okay, and you don't have to be a big company to do this. So for my startup, when I was trying to figure out if people liked my idea, I went down to BART, which is our underground system for transportation in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I stood in front of BART, and I had one tagline, and I would just say it to people as they walked by. I would just tell them my tagline. Hey, would you be interested in playing this? Would you be interested in viewing this? Does this sound like a good idea to you? And I got a lot of feedback that way from people who were in my target market. So you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be big in order to get user feedback. There are also lots of services that will enable you to get feedback from real players. So usertesting.com is a great one. It does cost money though. So if you can't afford usertesting.com, show up at an event like this with a bunch of iPads or whatever device you're testing on and get feedback from people here, anywhere you can. There are lots of ways to get feedback, but once you ship, right, to a platform, once you ship, you want to collect quantitative feedback. So look at services like Mixpanel that will offer that as an out-of-the-box service so that you don't have to build analytics into your game. So another thing to think about is that players are more forgiving than you think. So, again, we do hundreds and hundreds of cohort tests, A/B multivariate tests on our games. And they don't always work out. And a big part of doing iterative development is positioning and how you talk about new features with your audience. So every single time you launch something new, tell your players what's great about it, but also tell them that it's work in progress and that you want their feedback. Okay, so if you're contextualizing shipping early product and shipping fast, players are very forgiving of that. They'll do everything they can to help you. And then another thing to think about, which is really important, is that a lot of people worry that if they sandbox their game, the first 10,000 people who come in and play it, they'll be lost forever. It may be true, okay? So I'll just put that out there. If you launch product really early, it's possible that you will lose the first wave of people. Yes, sandboxing a game. Yeah, so that terminology refers to keeping a game in development for a very long time until you think it's polished enough to ship. So perfecting a game. Yeah, thank you for asking. So a lot of people say, if you lose the first 10,000 people that are playing your game, oh no, it's, this is a huge problem. Well, it's not actually a huge problem because your market probably isn't 10,000 people. Your market might be 10 million people or 200 million people. There's a much bigger audience out there. So think about them and keep your eye on the prize and make sure that you're iterating with those first 10,000 people so that you're building something sticky and fun so that you can reach the 200 million people. This is all about just figuring out the best way to make great product. You do that through feedback, through analytics, and through vision, okay? Design is really important too. Ship early and keep working. It's a fundamental tenet of this process. Ship early, keep working. And last but not least, We're okay. Okay, so brand equity. This is usually, big companies like to complain about this a lot. I hear a lot of this from companies like EA, Ubisoft. Somebody came to my GDC talk in, I'm not sure, maybe it was China, and said, I work for Ubisoft, how do I ship, how do I use this model for a console game? Everybody's going to think poorly of Ubisoft if I ship an early game and keep working. If it's not perfect, it's going to damage our brand. So since there aren't really any big game developers in the house, I'm not going to talk too much about that. If you're little, this doesn't matter. Nobody's heard of your brand. You don't have a brand. Nobody will care if you ship early and keep working, okay? If you're mid-size, maybe you care a little, and here's what I would say. The answer to this question is fundamentally the same for everybody, whether you're small or large. You have to include context when you're shipping early. Okay, so again, developing a relationship with your audience and being honest with them, hey, I'm shipping early product. This is early. If you like it, I'll keep working on it and I'll make it better. This is how Instagram got to the size they are today. And this is how GSN tripled their business in under 12 months. So this is an example. We made a game called RPG Slots. And we made it, again, for a hackathon. It was a lot of fun. And the developer, before we shipped this game to our beta community, the developer put a little message up that said, hey, I made this game during a 48-hour contest, so it's really rough, but if you like it and you give us positive feedback, we'll create a complete, attractive, fully featured version of the game. He drew a little picture of himself. He said, enjoy. He put his name up there, and there was a play button. 10,000 people played this game. We got quantitative and qualitative feedback. Our beta community is about, I would say, 100,000 people at this point. It's very, very big. But I can tell you that this personalized message from Travis, the game developer who made this game, made all of the difference for our players. We had 3x the amount of survey feedback sent in that we normally do with games. And people were, even if they didn't like the game, they took the time to give us feedback and they were very positive about the message. And the message for us is really all about include your players in the creation of your game. Okay, the internet is participatory and more the expectation is that your game will be participatory too. So it's my opinion that the age of developers creating games for themselves in black boxes is gone. Okay, you have access to people all over the world who would love to play your game and provide feedback on your game and help you turn it into something that they will enjoy and that will make your business huge. So involve them, include them. That can even be an enhancement for your brand, okay? So GSN, we have positioned our brand and our service as, we are the game company that listens to our players. We treat every single player like a VIP. This is absolutely essential to us. So we've built a brand around communicating with our players, and it's basically, allowed us to take this process as far as we have, doing cross-platform game development on 4 platforms. So this context really matters. Just tell people what you're doing and why. Key takeaways, the contextual environment for testing new games. So if you are building on mobile, how many of you are building games on mobile? Okay, so this process is, there are a couple of things that you need to know about this process if you're building on mobile. You should still do everything that I told you to do, but only ship on Android. Don't ship on iOS if you're shipping early product because it's very, very easy to iterate quickly on Android. It's very, very hard to iterate on iOS. So create a contextual environment for testing new games. Android even has a testing platform, a beta platform that you can tie into. Use early games to build lasting relationships and loyalty with your players. Turn your players into your game evangelists. They will work hard for you in recruiting new users if you include them in the process. I already said this, but the internet's participatory and games should be too, and I really believe this. And you can do it without sacrificing your vision. And then build experiences that resonate with the psyche of your audience by including them from the beginning. This is so important. So, if you want to make sure that the value that you think you're bringing to people by building them this entertainment experience, that you're actually communicating that value, that it's received well, and that you're bringing joy to their lives. Because ultimately, as game developers, we are trying to bring joy to people's lives. So the feedback loop is very, very important. Context is critical. Okay, so questions. I have no business cards, by the way, but I'm happy to answer any questions we don't get to today. You can just email me, kdeleon@gsn.com, or you can get me on Twitter. I'm @kdel. I get a lot of questions about metrics and what metrics to track and user testing too, but fire away if you guys have questions. I'll give you this. Anybody?
Hello, my name is Juan. I know this kind of development has become very popular now with the come of Steam Greenlight. A lot of people is putting their games, and I'm starting to see that the people is complaining a little bit about this. Like now everyone's putting their games when it's totally unplayable. There is a lot of bugs and so on. Do you think this will fire back to us?
So this is a really important question. And I think that the answer here is, again, context is critical. If you're shipping an early game, you have to tell people that it's very early and you want their feedback and you need their help to develop it into something great. If you tell people that early on, you know, they'll be patient with you. They'll provide you with feedback. I really think just you have to involve players and you have to set expectations up front. So, you know, another thing to note about this process is that bugs are special. So I'm not advocating shipping product with bugs, okay? Whenever you ship, so if you're using the lean development process, you have to polish. You should always build good product. It's just about how big is the product that you're building, okay? Like if you're building Skyrim, well, somebody should build Skyrim, but not in the casual game space, not in the free-to-play game space. You know, if you're building a game like that, the expectations are very, very high. If you're in the free-to-play casual game space, you have a lot more wiggle room, and you can tell people, hey, this is a work in progress, because they're not spending $60 to buy your disc-based game, right? It's hopefully this process works best with free-to-play games. And so if you're not charging them money when they walk in the door, then you can set the expectation appropriately with them. But you have to polish your game. You shouldn't be shipping with A-bugs, big bugs. Just make a small, polished game. It should be fun. Doesn't have to be big. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Here. I have a question about the pitching process, because
Yes.
you asked, I would like to ask you about explaining a little bit how much guessing and engineering is in the pitching process.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's pitching for different levels. Okay, so I don't expect an engineer, although they can all do this, but usually they won't. I don't expect an engineer to put together like a SOM analysis, a serviceable and obtainable market analysis. But we do that on the business side. So, you know, if the pitch process for us, it's really just a sentence. Here's the high-level idea of the game, and anybody can do that. And the differentiator, this is why my game is unique and distinct in the marketplace. That's absolutely critical because it's a very competitive landscape right now. And growth is also very hard in the market right now. So the differentiator is essential. The hard part and sort of where the level of expertise becomes really important is in the market analysis. So, you know, doing a top-down, anybody can do an internet search and figure out what the total addressable market is or how many dollars are in the entire game industry. That's not helpful, but what is helpful is knowing how many people are in your target demographic, and you can also largely source that research for free online. Research groups like Magid will provide demographic data, usually for free to developers. If you're an indie, email them, tell them that you're an indie and you need some free data from them, and usually they will give it to you. But find out how many people are in the demographic. And then the part that is it's anybody can do this, but it takes some thinking through. Is then when you're figuring out what the obtainable market is, you have to write down all of your assumptions. Okay, so what platform are you targeting? You're targeting Android. Well, how many people in your demographic are on Android? You can also just get that from an internet search. Then you need to think about, okay, let's say I'm assuming that they're going to spend, I can actually attract some portion of these people because I am developing my game in Polish, right? And so the Polish-speaking market is this big. So you have to list out each of your assumptions because of competition. Also, that's another factor that you need to consider when you're building your market opportunity analysis. So I think if anybody in your company is pitching and you're asking anybody in the pitch level, I think they can just provide a high level. There are 80 million 40 to 60-year-old women in the United States playing social games. But if you're pitching to an investor, you're going to have to do more due diligence than that. And really, it's just, again, itemizing all of your assumptions and just thinking about the breakdown. You can build a bottom-up analysis that way.
Okay,
Does that answer your question? Is that more complex?
Yes, exactly.
than
Thank you.
Yeah.
Heyo.
Hey.
There seems to me that there's a whole bunch of kind of emotional responses that we get from a development community about not just this issue, but free to play and monetization and all that. And I worry that the kind of language, because we kind of have an interest in the business side of things, I wonder whether the language that we inevitably use, because we're learning from what other industries are doing and applying our passion for games to that, languages like minimum viable product get misunderstood, I think. And is this a question of language, or is it a question? So, for example, do we call it minimum awesome product rather than viable? It's the same thing.
Oh God, Oscar, that's such a good idea.
Yeah.
Minimum awesome product. No, I love that because you're right. I think that the terminology, a lot of people think when they think minimum viable product, they think consumer web. And what comes to mind is the very early days of shipping, as Juan, is that your name? Right. As Juan said, really buggy product, right? And just testing it out on the masses and having the masses get really mad at you.
And make them do your QA, which you should have done yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's not do that in the game industry.
Not again.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we do need to talk about this process differently because I've given this talk a few times, and I would say, on average, 40% of people in the audience hate everything that I'm saying. And usually it's because they think that this process alienates designers. It doesn't. We really, really need designers. They design the core game loop. They're super important. Or they think that it means shipping buggy product. It doesn't. Polish is very, very important. So, yeah, maybe we should call it something else.
Because what I worry is that we get people who are realizing that we're in a massive amount of change. It's unprecedented change in terms of development and design of games.
Yes.
And that fear of change, I think, allows people who are vulnerable to that fear to use straw man arguments against, free-to-play becomes evil because it's about monetization first, when it shouldn't be. It should be about building services.
Yes.
Lean startup is evil because it stops us building the beautifully exciting, over-engineered experiences we would like to make.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, yes, one thing that you didn't mention that I also encounter a lot, there's a lot of resistance to doing data-driven development because the idea is that data somehow undermines our instincts. And the reality is that, yes, sometimes it does, and that's okay. Statistics is awesome, and it serves a purpose, and our instincts are awesome too, and they serve another purpose. But doing data-driven development is really what gives you the information that you need as a game designer, say, to make better games, to design solutions to problems that your users are having. So, yeah, we should rebrand it. Let's call it something else. You should work on that with me, by the way. Okay.
Last question, anyone?
This gentleman right here had a question. Yeah.
Well, you said that the early prototype should validate a single hypothesis. How to ensure that? How can you ensure that it is in fact validating the hypothesis that you thought it validates, and not something else that got to the product from the side?
Both. So you might find in the prototyping phase that you've built something and you had a hypothesis and you thought that your game was designed to validate that hypothesis, it might turn out that actually it's validating something completely different. Okay, so a good example of that in our catalog, the skinnable slots example, that engine that we created, we actually created that to test the cadence. Our hypothesis was if we release a new game that's functionally exactly the same with different art every week, then we'll see an uptick in DAUs. Well, it turned out that that's not true. Nobody wants to play the same game with just new art every week. But what we did discover was that we had a theme, an art theme, that was really resonant in our classic 777 game. So we learned something very different from what we expected to learn. Again, why data and testing is important. I would say that, maybe 50% of the time when you think you're validating your hypothesis, you're not. So one of the really important things here is you have to be careful about how you ask people questions. Okay, so you have to make sure that you're not leading them to validate your hypothesis. And this is a whole area of expertise, how to ask people questions so that you get unbiased answers. But if you give me your card, I'd be very happy to send you an email more information about this because I know that we're out of time. But yeah, it's really important to ask questions in a neutral way to find out if your game is really delivering on what you hoped it would.
Okay. Thank you.
But also it's okay if it delivers on something totally different. Success is success. Thanks, you guys.